Welcome to the Former Farm Kid channel. Today we're looking at an really do-it-yourself, easy, cheap, what I call a utility slash serving table for your deck, or basically anywhere that you need it. I built this for less than $40, I believe. I did recycle or use some recycled parts for the diagonal bracing. These right here, you can kind of tell a color difference, but those are still less than $2, I believe. They're basically former stair railing spindles, just basically 2x2s. So I do call it a utility slash serving table for the simple reason that it is only 2x10, two 2x10s wide. And for me, it's absolutely perfect. But as far as a dining table goes, you would want to add probably a 2x6 in the center, or even another 2x10. That would allow you to move the legs a little bit wider, because I needed it very narrow for my deck and my working, and I kind of like to leave the legs tucked in for protection. Plus, when I'm working at the side and moving left to right, I'm not constantly stubbing my toe on it. But as you can see, it doesn't take too much to push it over. So with small kids, you wouldn't want to make something quite this narrow unless you were going to anchor it down. And the reason I call it a utility slash serving table is at this width, if you put a plate here and a plate there, they're pretty much close to touching. So anything else on the table would have to go between. So that's just one aspect of that. So getting into the specifics of it, it is pressure treated as well. So if you were going to use it as an eating or a dining table, you would want to do something to seal the surface. Since 2003, pressure treated wood has not been treated with arsenic, but prior to that, that's basically what was being injected into the wood. Today, it's all the chromate families, particularly copper chromate. There's some other chromates they use as well. And that industry says it's perfectly safe for human contact. Food contact, I would not feel all that comfortable with it. So if I were going to use this as a dining table, I would definitely give this either a coating of latex paint, a couple of coats. You could also cover it with epoxy. The pressure treated wood industry says you can also use urethane on the top. You would want an outdoor, which would be like a spar varnish, basically. For my purposes, what I'm going to do, I treat it with a clear preservative for a couple of reasons. It's a piece of cake to put on. It goes on like water, and it causes the wood to bead. It's sort of like a deck sealer, except it has additional chemicals in the wood or in the product, just like the pressure treating elements here, to help preserve the wood. And it's really important to, when you do paint or you do put something for a surface, that you really hit the end grain here really, really heavily, because that is where the wood will absorb moisture. And the same with the feet. You would want to take the bottoms off and really hit that end grain. Wood basically won't absorb water except for surface water on the surface, but that evaporates right away. It dries. In the end grain, that moisture keeps moving into the wood. So you really want to hit that really well. So I built this table with two 2x10s. It took three 2x4s. The diagonal bracing on the legs actually took just one spindle, And then the feet, the base feet, they call those standoffs, the black portions there. I could not find 2x4 standoffs, so I took a 4x4 and cut it in half. I cut that in half on my my steel chop saw with a 72 tooth carbide blade. If you don't have one of those, which you probably don't, you don't want to use an abrasive blade. It will just make a mess. You could also use a hacksaw. I don't know that I would want to use a good handsaw on it. Chances are it would not dull the blade, but if you have a hacksaw, that is probably the way to go. So then the dimensions are very simple. The 2x10s I have here are 8 feet, and the legs measure 26.5 for a total rise from the standoff, the black portion, or from the ground to the very top of the table will be 29 inches. And usually for tables, we shoot for around 30. But since I'm using this as more or less a work table, I kind of like to be able to hover over it. So I've left it at 29 inches. A little bit about the underneath of it. As you can see, my horizontal cross ties, which hold the 2x10s together, I mitered all the ends because it just gives it a much dressier appearance. Held them in from the end a little bit, just to keep them out of the weather, basically. And of course, when you're putting your finish on, you should hit that end grain really well, as well, even though it's not going to be exposed to a lot of water, but it's a good idea always to do that. One other thing I wanted to mention too, as far as finish goes, is you're always going to have knots. I mean, this is actually select wood, but still, and I have the best face up, but when you have an episode, something like this, you're going to need to use an epoxy wood filler. And what I do, I prime it with liquid epoxy, mix that liquid epoxy into the 2-part wood epoxy, and then fill my knots. The rest of the knots are looking pretty good. There's very, very small imperfections. They don't really bother me. And the other thing I wanted to talk about is holding the whole thing together with the use of screws. You don't want to use nails, because if one of these members were to warp or something like that, or get a lot of damage or start rotting, because even pressure treated wood is not bulletproof. It can eventually rot, especially if you don't take care of it. Coating it with preservative or putting a clear coat over the top to kind of give it a rain shield. This thing should go 30, 40, 50 years for you. But the screws I used are basically decking screws. And the reason I use these is because they're just the right length. Because I screw from the bottom up, so on the surface here, you can see there are no screws. All the screws come from the bottom up. This particular screw matches the wood as far as color goes. It has a star drive end on it, and it is serrated because basically I generally do not put any screws in that I don't drill pilot holes first. This screw, when used on wood decking, does not require a pilot hole. These flutes right here and the serration here basically drill a hole large enough so that when you put the screw in, you want to clench from the head of the screw instead of from the threads. If you don't do the pilot hole for the screws, you will jack your members apart. So for decking, you wouldn't need to, but because this is two 1.5 inch thick pieces being put together, you need to do pilot holes for the screw. Otherwise, it's going to actually separate the pieces when the head comes to contact. And you'll see that if you don't do that. So another thing people ask me about, well, what about putting it together? When is the best time? And what I generally do is I will, because pressure treated lumber, basically they are forcing under pressure the treatment into the lumber. And so when you buy from the store, it can be anywhere from 25 to 40 to even 50% moisture. And some sources are quoting it even higher than that. So there's two school of thoughts. When timber framers timber frame a home, obviously they cannot wait for those timbers to totally dry out. So they build that house green with the assumption that because all those timbers are locked in really strong mortise and tenon joints that prevent those timbers from warping, cupping, twisting, bending, crowning. And on a table like this, there are so few connections that it's probably a good idea to let your lumber dry 30 to 60 days in a stickered fashion. So what I mean by that is you lay your 2x4s flat on a flat surface with air beneath them, so stickered at least every couple of feet. So a 2x8, 2x10 rather, should have probably 4 stickers, which is just a small piece of wood all the same size, beneath it and above it to keep air flowing. And that allows the lumber to dry. So you put the 2x10s on the bottom, stack the 2x4s on top, and then they need to be weighted down quite a bit because you're trying to stop all the movement in the wood as it dries, especially on the ends, because they're the closest to the end grain, and that end of the board will dry quicker than the rest of the board. So that's where the warping tries to stay, or tries basically to be the most severe. So 30-60 days, you've got a pretty good shot of the wood not moving once you get it all put together. I wasn't too concerned with that. I went ahead, did not give it that much time. Went ahead and build it. I did get a little warping on my end boards here, which you can kind of see. There's a little bit of height difference in that one. This one down here is pretty good. And the rest of it, 2x4s don't warp as badly as 2x10s. So that part turned out to be okay. But that would be my recommendation. And as long as I'm down here looking at this, the one thing that really gives this table a little bit of added oomph are the tight-fitting diagonal braces, basically built as rafters with the same trigonometry. And I'm going to do a whole piece on that next as to how to get these nice tight joints at both ends. It really gives your table just a little bit of pizzazz, but it really, I mean, you cannot really build this without supporting these legs. And the other thing I should mention too, that if you go with 3 2x10s, you need to have 2 on each side, diagonal braces. Otherwise, your legs are going to want to do this. They're going to want to walk because they will rotate at this center point if they're any much more wider than this. So that's something to keep in mind. Some of the detailing. As you notice, I've got my corners rounded over. I just took, just find something in your house that the radius you like, and I basically just got a Dixie cup and did mine. I also rounded over the edge here with a 1/4-inch roundover bit. You really don't need to take it all the way down. This already has like an 1/8 inch roundover done on it. Those are not sharp corners. They do actually round them off at the factory. But for the end grain, for the edges, for the ends on the tops and the bottoms, I used a 1/4-inch roundover bit. Your kids, when they're walking underneath it, will really appreciate that. Of course, I'm using mine for a utility table, so 2x10s come pre-sanded, but if you're going to put a nice finish on it, you're probably going to want to hit the surface with a 220 grit sandpaper. You could do it by hand. You could also do it with an orbital sander. And you don't need to go as low as 150, 220 would be fine for something like this. We already talked about filling the knots with epoxies. I did, on my table, put a drip edge on it, and it's just a kerf run down the width of the table to keep water from running down here and just keeping on going and staining your underneath and leaving water drips hanging underneath the table. It has a tendency to damage the wood, basically. The standoffs are really important as well. These black things on the bottom of the legs. Like I said, they don't, I believe, I thought they made 2x4 ones. I couldn't find any, couldn't even find any online. So took the 4x4 standoffs, cut them in half. And the whole idea, you do not want end grain sitting in water. It will constantly soak that water up and eventually rot your legs. Even if you've treated it underneath, that treatment only goes so far and the water will keep coming. That's how trees bring moisture to the leaves. Water passes parallel to the grain, just like a big old straw. And we talked about sealing, painting, So that pretty much covers the majority of the construction. My horizontal ties here, I believe I have 9 inches up. The legs were, I think I already talked about that, I'm pretty 26.5 inches. And, you know, everything else is pretty straightforward. And again, I'm going to do a whole video on how to do these diagonals. It's all basic trigonometry, and it's really, really easy to do. And it just gives your table that extra little pizzazz. Okay, guys, thanks for watching. Give me a thumbs up if you like it. See you on part 2.